Year's Eve, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered his 2023 New Year address through China Media Group and the internet. Looking ahead to the new year, he quoted Su Shi, a renowned Chinese poet, "Charge at the toughest and aim at the farthest," which means to take on the biggest challenges and go after the most ambitious goals. What are China's ambitious goals in 2023? What challenges will China face in the post-pandemic era? And how will the country turn its economy back? Welcome to the special series of Looking Ahead 2023, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin, from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Sydney, Australia by Professor David Goodman, Director of China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. From Beijing by Professor Xue Lan, Dean of Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University. From Washington, D.C. by Surabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. And from Portland, the U.S. by Professor Liang Yan, Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. The warmest welcome to all of you and Happy New Year, first of all. So President Xi Jinping mentioned challenges or difficulties a total of 9 times in his short New Year address. When he talked about a Politburo Standing Committee member's special visit to Yan'an, one of the sacred land for Chinese Revolution, right after the 20th CPC National Congress last year, he said, "We were there," and he quoted in the New Year address, "to relive the inspiring episode in which the party's central leadership overcame extraordinary difficulties in the 30s, in the 1930s and the 1940s, and draw on the spiritual strengths of the older generation of Chinese revolutionaries." He said, "Just as polishing makes jade finer, adversity makes one stronger." So let me go to Professor Goodman first. Why do you think he's stressing this particular point in his New Year's address, especially when he talks about extraordinary, when he, reminds people of the extraordinary difficulties the elder generations of Chinese revolutionaries were facing? Professor Goodman.
Well, I think the answer is quite obvious. The last 3 years have seen the world economy and everything that goes with it create difficulties for everybody. And China is no exception to this. And I think the need to remind people of what's happened in the past and what can happen in the future is quite amply symbolized by going to Yan'an. Of course, it doesn't hurt anybody that Xi Jinping's father was there even before Mao Zedong, but that's beside the point.
But what kind of specific difficulties would he have in mind when he reminds people of the 1930s and 1940s, when we are at this particular historical juncture? Professor Goodman still.
Oh, well, I mean, in the 1930s, the problem was the invasion from Japan. And that was, a major confrontation that was coming, and everybody knew it, and that was the end of it. We don't have that situation now, but we do have the question of reinvigorating the world economy in the wake of the pandemic, and that is equally as big a conflict. But it's not a conflict necessarily between countries; it's a conflict with with nature, in a sense, that the world, that's thrown up this virus, which is still with us, even though we now have to live with it. So I think that's for me, that's the context. It requires everybody to pull together and do their bit. Of course, if you go back to Yan'an days, it wasn't the case that everybody was pulling together. I mean, the country was divided in lots of different ways, and there was a group of people who decided in Yan'an to run with what they thought was right. And in the end, they were very successful come 1949.
Professor Xue, it is really rather extraordinary, right, to hear the president of China talking about revisiting the past, especially the period of extraordinary difficulties. Right now, as we stand, in the beginning of the year 2023, what do you think are the specific challenges President Xi or the Chinese central leadership has in mind when they're giving this kind of New Year address?
I think that, as Professor Goodman said, I mean, the last 3 years have really, had a huge impact on the global economy, and China is no exception. And also domestically, I think people have really experienced a 3-year really sort of hardship in terms of fighting with the virus, and then going through various kind of lockdown and so on. And now I think that it's hopefully the last chapter is ongoing in China. So I think you do need to, I think encourage people to think of the, sort of the hardship of the 1930s and 40s, when the things are much worse and the challenges are much greater. And it's really how actually people can work together to persevere and hopefully win the last chapter of the battle. Also, I think that I think in President Xi's speech, he also mentioned that China is a huge country. People may have different opinions, so let's find a way to work out and then to unite together. And that really shows, indeed, I think that's the current situation we are in. We've seen the difficulties in fighting the virus. Different people may have different ways to think about what's the best way to do. But I think that once we've decided what to do, and then I think that we have to work together.
What specific terms, what specific barometer could you give, Professor Xu, to the audience as to the magnitude of the challenges we're faced with, in terms of the economy, as a result of 3 years of really very difficult fight against this very, this unprecedented challenge we've not faced over the past 100 years?
Well, I think maybe I'll give you 2 numbers. I think the first, I think not necessarily a number, but this is probably the first time in many years, maybe, I don't know, maybe it started from the reform in the late 1970s, that China's economic growth rate is lower than many of the neighboring countries, such as India and such as, Thailand and many other countries. And that's probably the first time. So that really shows the challenge that we are facing. And the other number is that I think as many people know, that China is experiencing a surge of the Omicron. And again, that number, of course, different people have different estimates, because I think now there's it's official estimate is very difficult to get, because there's not no longer testing, it's no longer requested. So I think that, but different estimates, can put the number into several hundreds of millions of people, and so that's, again, it's a huge number, and so that's what we're facing up with.
Right, you're talking about the onslaught of the Omicron
exactly at the moment
infection, that we're actually going through at this moment. Some cities are experiencing rather great difficulties in the medical care systems. Professor Gupta, how do you read the kind of specific emphasis on extraordinary difficulties President Xi mentioned, and the need to overcome these difficulties with the same kind of revolutionary spirits that led China out of the old world and into a new period in 1949?
Yes, the COVID-19 challenge is a very, very significant and very difficult challenge, I would say, for the first 3, perhaps even the first 6 months of 2023. We have to remember, Taiwan went from less than 1,000 cases, less than 1,000 casualties, to more than 10,000 casualties within a 6-month period after its opening up in 2022. It's when it relaxed its protocols significantly. There was a real spike in mortality. And we're talking Taiwan is a 23 million population.
You were talking about the numbers in the region of Taiwan.
Yes, the numbers in the region of Taiwan and how there was a spike out there.
Yeah.
And we can, if we extrapolate, the numbers could also be very high on the mainland. And so it is a very difficult phase at this point of time, taking care of the elderly who are going to be face the difficult challenge that lies ahead in the next few months. But beyond that, beyond the COVID issue, and I think the COVID issue will fade away by mid-year when there is kind of very significant immunity within the population. But I think another issue which President Xi is alluding to is the issue of technology suppression that the US has inflicted on the United States, on China, within the past 2 years, and Mr. Biden has followed through on the lines of Mr. Trump in this regard. I mean, President Xi has grappled with this issue and is seeing this right. Many of these fourth industrial revolution technologies will determine leadership and success for the next quarter century or even more. And China is facing a real risk in the semiconductor sector. And I think President Xi is talking about really girding one's loins and making those investments that need to be made in human capital, in technology development, so that China has some degree of self-sufficiency and can compete in these fourth industrial revolution technologies. It will take time. It's not easy. It's going to be an arduous process. And it's going to be a process no less difficult than the time I would say in the late 1950s, when the Soviet technicians came back at the time of China's atom bomb development, and China had to do it all by itself and managed to do so in just a couple of years. This one will be longer and harder, but I think Mr. Xi is very focused on this. And we've seen that also in the composition of many of the senior appointees at the Politburo, in the Politburo Standing Committee, who have been shuffled around because Mr. Xi understands the importance that technology supremacy or technology competition will engender going forward in this year and in this decade and the decades thereafter.
Professor Leung, do you share also the opinion that one of the issues that President Xi was alluding to was this technology decoupling or race for technology advantage that is, or this competition that the United States is fixated at this moment vis-a-vis China?
I absolutely agree with the previous speakers. I think the challenges are threefold. We know that there is a health threat, the pandemic, even though now has been downgraded in terms of the severity, but we know that many people will still get infected. So I think some of the credible estimation would put, the number of infection to the 60% of the Chinese population by the end of January. So yes, there are some bumpy, roads ahead. And second, I think, is the economic challenges. And so I think that is also due to a very difficult choice of the government to balance, economic gains with the protection of people's health and lives. So we know this year, the IMF has forecasted that China's growth rate is probably going to be at 2.7%, which is much lower than the official target of around 5.5%. And on top of that, we know that there are other challenges internally, but also externally. That leads to the third, I think, challenge, which has to do with the broader geopolitical tensions and also some of the unfriendly policies, like Professor Gupta has pointed out, the trade war and now the tech war. So I think all these challenges are ahead. But I agree, what I think President Xi pointed out is not just the challenges, but also what requires us to do, which is to build that unity, have the courage to try to craft, sensible policies in order to boost the economy going forward.
Well, the economy is definitely an important part of President Xi's New Year address, and basically, I would say one of the top priorities for the Chinese government to tackle, especially for the first half of this year. Let's focus on the economy a little bit. He was talking about President Xi was talking about China's GDP for the whole year of 2022. Expected to exceed 120 trillion yuan. That's about 17.5 trillion US dollars. And of course, he also points to the strong resilience, the tremendous potential and great vitality. Professor Goodman, how much challenge is there in terms of the Chinese economy going in the first half of 2023? And how much resilience do you sense there is as well? So, both sides of the same coin.
So I think in the first half of the year, quite obviously, the major problem is dealing with the after effects or the continuing effects of the pandemic. People are still somewhat restricted in where they can go and what they can do. And this of course, impacts on the workforce apart from anything else. So I think there, the government, from the government's point of view, they just have to understand that growth will be slower in the first analysis. I think the longer term view is much more interesting, because what needs to happen now going forward is that there is more real disposable income built into the Chinese economy. And that can only happen if there is greater welfare provision. Obviously, because individuals currently save in order to meet their own welfare requirements in the future. And that, I think, is what the policy goal of common prosperity is all about. And I'm very excited. I think that would really be something, if something could be done about ensuring, at least at the city prefecture level, that there was more hospitals, more doctors, more education, more old people's care.
Yeah, but I think, well, here some people would ask this question, look, it's a balance of a longer term approach to a shorter term remedy.
Sure,
because we're talking about the first half here, and you can't possibly achieve a greater common prosperity when the economy is, continuing a downward spiral. So do you think they are going to still focus on the common prosperity goals when the economy, consumption?
I don't think there's any choice. I think if the goal for 2035 of 5.5% per annum growth in GDP over that whole period is to be met, then there has to be greater welfare provision at the local level, and that will mean a number of things, not just the goal of common prosperity, but also improving the personal taxation system. Look around the world in terms of welfare provision. What percentage of personal income tax in every country goes to government revenue? China is very, very low. It needs to ensure that there is redistribution that pays for offsetting those welfare costs for individuals. And that can only be done through the taxation system.
Well, Professor Xu, let me ask your opinion. Do you agree that this is the time to address this inequality issue when consumption is really at an extremely low time? People are putting their money in the bank. And if you talk about taxation or greater taxation, this is definitely going to scare people away from spending more. And that's what's not needed at this moment for the Chinese economy.
Let's look at this issue, I think, from three dimensions. One is how to balance short-term and long-term goals. I think that I fully agree with Professor Goodman that in terms of long-term goals, I think the common prosperity is really, in essence, it's the key for so-called high-quality growth. I think that's what certainly China will, I think, keep that in mind very clearly. But as you said, I think at the moment, I think for the first half of probably for 2023, really the key is how to to promote the engine, to get engine started, and to really make it the economy run fast. I think here I would say that China has already prepared a whole set of sort of policy measures to promote the consumption, promote the economic growth, as we've seen from the Central Economic Conference held in last December. So I think that that's a short term. Certainly, I think there's that things will certainly in that direction. The second thing I think we also wanted to see that China is a huge country with different regions have very kind of different situations. So I think that it's not going to be every province is going to be on the same pace. We've already seen that as soon as China started to open up, you see Zhejiang and Guangdong, and they're already sending their business teams to other countries to get
the eastern coastal areas, right?
So I think I would say that in those regions, the recovery is going to be much faster, and so they will. I think you will see the economy is going to boom and so on. Consumption will follow. However, in many other regions, I think that's probably going to be much slower, particularly over the last 3 years. I think many SMEs couldn't, many of them really, just closed. So now to restart those businesses are much harder, and that really is going to take quite some time to regain, those kind of strengths. And the third, I think, is also coming to the consumption side. I think a lot of people lost jobs over the last, 3 years, and maybe couldn't really pay their, sort of mortgage and so on. So I think that there also, I think, to get people to have the confidence to spend is also going to take some time. So there are some proposals saying that China should really, give out some, money to every, citizen to spend. But whatever the ways you do, I assume different regions may do different things. But how to really get people to be confident to be able to spend some money, I think that's something, the third thing that we also need to look at.
Yeah. Well, but do you think there is, immediately, for instance, after the second half of December, let's say, after that is gone, you start to see traffic jam on the roads in Beijing again. Obviously, people are eager to go back to work, to go back to big business. How do you look at the level of resilience of the Chinese economy, especially the private sector, of course, the state-owned sector as well, but, the private sector, which employs huge numbers of people. How do you look at the resilience of that sector, Professor Xu?
I think, first of all, I think overall the Chinese economy is very resilient. I think part of that resilience comes from the what do you say, the diversity in terms of the different regions, different sectors, and so on, and that's sort of the sources of resilience. But at the same time, we also have to be mindful that every sector, no matter whether it's multinationals, SOEs or SMEs, every sector suffered hugely over the last 3 years, and so in a way, everybody needs some time to recover, to regroup, and to rethink about the strategy. Particularly, I think in light of the, at least I think the previous speaker have already mentioned about 3 challenges, and the ending COVID is only one. And the global economy is still recovering, and the geopolitical environment is still there. So I think for many of the companies, they need to really rethink about what they can do in this kind of new environment. So it will not be a smooth, recovery, but certainly I think that from what we've seen over the last 40+ years, and I think that resilience certainly is there.
Professor Gupta, how would you compare the difficulties the world economy is facing at this particular moment with that of 2008? I mean, back then, China was in relatively good shape, and China and the United States were able to join hands, or China was able, to provide some kind of a relief for the United States and for other countries that were in deep trouble. Now you mentioned the tech war that the US has launched on China at this particular moment when the world economy is not looking at some good news. How much trouble is there going to be? And does the United States realize that this is probably not the best moment to launch a tech war on China when the world is very much in need of a collective economic recovery if we're not going to sink together?
I think you're absolutely correct on that front. There have been very drastic and draconian technology embargo and denial measures over the last 2 years. And the fruits of that, the bitter fruits of that, are going to be felt in the next year or two when there's a downturn in many of those tech sectors. But speaking of the broader global economy, I am not too pessimistic. The advanced economies are looking at some form of recession. Probably not a harsh recession, maybe a softer landing, but they are looking at a downturn in some respects. Emerging markets have held their own fairly well despite the real jacking up of the US interest rates and the pressure that it has placed on their currencies. But most of them have coped well. We know there are cases of debt distress, but most have coped well. And I am actually fairly optimistic about the Chinese economy becoming a motor of growth for the global economy, especially during the latter part of 2023. I think where the Chinese government is going, and rightly so, is to recharge the animal instincts of the private sector. That is what will grow the Chinese economy dynamically, and it will help the world economy in tow, even if the advanced economies are not doing that great, given the food, energy, and other challenges that we're facing. And therefore, I think the role for the Chinese government primarily is to kind of support economic growth, support the private sector, while not exacerbating the domestic economic imbalances and the risks to financial stability, and to provide support to consumption. The Chinese government needs to become a bigger player on the consumption side of the economy too, both short-term and, of course, as Professor Goodman mentioned, from a longer-term perspective. But I am not a pessimist in terms of growth, global growth in 2023. What I am, though, pessimistic about is that advanced economies and emerging economies can sit at the table and really push the multilateral economic agenda forward. I think there's too big of a gap, a differential in that, and there are too many policy differences for that process to really be recharged in 2023, even though the Indonesian G20 chairpersonship did a great job. So, but just talking growth, I'm more optimist than pessimist in 2023 because of China and because of emerging markets.
Many thanks to Professor David Goodman, Professor Xuelan Surab Gupta, and Professor Liang Yan for joining us on this special edition of Looking Ahead 2023. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Lixin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got the point. And once again, Happy New Year. Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point.